And welcome to everyone, wherever you are. So, today and tomorrow, we're going to be looking at feedstocks for SAF production, availability, sustainability, supply chains, etc., and also like chemistry, characteristics, and so on, and how that impacts SAF production. So, at the end of the course, you should be able to understand the different types of feedstocks that can be used for SAF production based on different SAF technologies, including feedstock characteristics, quality, and what those present as challenges for SAF production. You should also understand the global availability of feedstocks and various limitations for availability, regional availability, distribution, and global trade, feedstock readiness and maturity of supply chains, and also the whole issue of feedstock sustainability, the carbon intensity and sustainability verification. And I'm mainly basing that on ICAO's carbon offset and reduction scheme for international aviation. So these are the core topics that I'll be covering. And so let's just kick it off. Yeah. So when we look at feedstock types, what we need to understand is that we have multiple feedstocks that can be used, and these are ideally suited to different types of technology pathways. And each the feedstock has unique characteristics and require different treatment and optimization. And when we look at feedstock availability, we realize that we need significant volumes of SAF to meet 2050 targets, and therefore it's critical to know what the feedstocks and the availability. But it can be quite confusing when you look at different reports because there's a lot of variability. And critical factors that we need to consider for feedstock availability is also competition with other applications and economic availability, i.e., what is the cost of the feedstocks that are available. And what we do know is that bio-based feedstocks will likely be limiting. So while we are focusing a lot on feedstock or technologies for SAF production, we don't always recognize that feedstock availability and supply chains have to also be ready, have a technology readiness level before they can be used. And a lot of availability of feedstocks include feedstocks that are not actually commercially ready or commercially available at scale, and also that they are not mature supply chains. And therefore, we need to also focus on establishing feedstock supply chains and looking at the types of policies that will also encourage development of feedstock supply chains at commercial levels. And we distinguish mainly between high energy density feedstocks that can be transported globally, and generally there are already mature supply chains for these feedstocks, such as vegetable oils, used cooking oils and fats, and ethanol, for example. But low energy density feedstocks are completely different, and this would be forest residues, agricultural residues, and they have to be accessed close to the biorefinery because it's expensive to transport them. And for these feedstocks, there are no supply chains in place. And then when we look at key takeaways for feedstocks sustainability, we have established minimum sustainability criteria under CORSIA and default carbon intensities, as well as a life cycle methodology for calculating carbon intensity where your production pathway is, you believe that it's lower than the default. However, or lower in terms of more emission reductions. However, what is quite clear if you know anything about this space is that there are huge differences between countries and also on regional levels. And this is quite a challenge. How do we harmonize the sustainability criteria? And Although what we will see is that we have very mature crops that are available in large volumes, but of course these are generally perceived to have challenges of sustainability, mainly because of food versus fuels. And there's a general perception that these are always have a poor carbon intensity. But what I will show you is that some of this issues with sustainability is also a political or a public perception rather than the reality, and that many crops can actually achieve the sustainability criteria set down by CORSIA. Okay, Daniel asked what are the main issues with the supply chains, and I'm going to get to that. This was just a kind of overall summary of key takeaways. We're going to take a deep dive into all of these areas. So feedstock types and characteristics. I kind of take a perspective on grouping pathways where you've got the pathway based on oils and fats, and that would include your HEFA pathway, as well as, say, catalytic hydrothermolysis jet. You have lignocellulose, which is forest residues, agricultural residues, and these are generally more suited for thermochemical processes. Then you get sugar and starch, which can also be derived from lignocellulose, and those would be used in biochemical production of, say, ethanol, or direct production of hydrocarbons. And then you have pathways that I would call hybrid. So this could be fermentation of CO2 or CO, as well as electrochemical or e-fuel types of processes. So, but that's how I group the different feedstocks. So these are the categories and the types of pathways that are suited for these different categories. So jet fuel is made of hydrocarbons, which is basically carbon and hydrogen. The characteristic of jet fuel is carbon range from 8 carbons to 16 carbons in a molecule. And therefore, essentially, you can take any source of carbon and hydrogen and use it to make SAF. So some technologies use existing hydrocarbons in the feedstock itself and turns it into jet fuel. For example, a HEFA pathway, pyrolysis, or hydrothermal liquefaction. But other technologies, such as gasification, breaks the molecules down to their core elements, so carbon monoxide and hydrogen. And in gasification, then you use like Fischer-Tropsch synthesis to build up the carbon chain to get your jet fuel range molecules. So the reason why I explained this is the fact that when you take the feedstock and process it, but you want to use the hydrocarbons in the feedstock, what you see is that a lot of the feedstock characteristics are still present when you need to try and upgrade it into jet fuel. And this will also require less processing. And when we look at something like fats and oils, which we call lipids, these are the simplest molecules to turn into jet fuel because they already resemble jet fuel hydrocarbon molecules. So when we look at plant material or any of these bio-based feedstocks, what we see is that they always contain oxygen. And this is a little bit of chemistry, which you don't need to know at all, but this is like a carboxylic acid that you will get in your oils and fats feedstocks. This is a hydroxyl group that you would get in ethanol, and then you get this ether type of molecule. So the takeaway is really that they all contain oxygen, but when we look at jet fuel, we do not want any oxygen. So one of the key things that you need to know is that when you upgrade any of these feedstocks into jet fuel, you have to remove all the oxygen. And this is usually done through hydrotreatment and other processes, but hydrogen is absolutely critical to remove the oxygen. And the characteristics of the feedstock will depend the extent to which you process it and the amount of hydrogen that you need. And then another process is isomerization, where you go from this to that. So you take a straight carbon chain and you want to create a branching, because this changes the cold flow properties. So this molecule will not be very good at cold temperatures, but this one will be quite a lot, have a lower freeze point. So I mentioned the energy density feedstocks. So when we look at high energy density feedstocks, they can be transported economically over great distances because the transport costs are not that high. And so this allows us to have large scale facilities and economies of scale. Here we look at oils and fats and say ethanol. And some of these facilities can be like 1 billion liters. And the only reason why we can get that kind of scale is because of the high energy density of the oils and fats that can be transported everywhere. So here, when we look at availability, we don't need to worry so much about what is available immediately in the area where we want to build a facility, because we can bring feedstocks in from anywhere. So what we see is that used cooking oil here from the US maybe goes here to Singapore, to a large facility there. From Canada, it goes to the US, or it goes to Asia. And then, like in Europe, most of their used cooking oil actually comes from China. And then you have like fats coming also from Australia into Singapore. So it can be transported absolutely anywhere. And because this is already happening, this is called a mature supply chain. But when we look at low energy density feedstocks, such as forest residues and agricultural residues, here we have to look at what is available within the immediate vicinity of where we want to build our SAF facility. I say here 100 to 150 kilometers, but actually you want something less than 100 kilometers, because these have a low energy density. And the reason for that is there's a lot of oxygen in forest residues in the chemistry. And there's also, they have a high water content. So basically, you're not transporting only carbon, you're transporting water and you're transporting oxygen, which means that it becomes a lot more expensive based on the volume that you want to produce. So what is really important, and what you see here on this tiny little map here, this is from the US billion-ton study where they evaluate feedstock availability across the US. And the little dots here, or it's basically at county level. They will tell you exactly in that county how much residues they are available. And this, for example, I think is I think agricultural residues such as corn stover. So what you'll see here is that there's no corn growing there. So this is where your facilities would have to be located, because you can't really transport these feedstocks over large distances. So when we look at feedstock availability, everyone wants to know, do we have enough feedstock? But what we have to realize is it's not that simple. We have to look at what is actually commercially available. And some feedstocks, for example, we talk about non-edible oilseed cover crops or energy crops such as miscanthus or switchgrass. And these are not actually cultivated at commercial scale at this stage. There's a lot of interest in it. There's a lot of research. There's a lot of companies that can supply seeds, but what we see is that these are not grown at commercial scale, so they are essentially not available. So when you look at the report, you have to assess, are they looking at potential for the future, or are they actually looking at feedstocks that are currently available? The other critical area is the supply chains, because if you don't put a supply chain in place, then you are counting that feedstock. So you might, for a large area, say a province here in Canada, say this is the feedstock that is available. But if you have to transport it over very long distances, that's not actually available. It's there, but it's not going to be realistic to move it to a facility. And you need mature supply chains. What we see often with these feedstocks is that it's a large component of the operating costs, and therefore you can transport it, but if you don't do an optimized mature supply chain, it becomes a lot more expensive, and then it makes the SAF more expensive and potentially not economically viable. So the cost of the feedstock is essential. So you might look at a report on forest residues and so on, but a lot of them say, okay, we only need to look at feedstocks at the cost of $60 per ton, because only then can we make SAF that is economically viable. And then, of course, we need to look at sustainability, because we don't want to include feedstocks that are not sustainable, because that doesn't give us a realistic assessment. And then also competition for feedstocks. So currently, if you look at, say, oils and fats, there's a lot of, most of it is used for food purposes. Some of it is used for making other types of fuels, such as biodiesel. We also have, say, forest residues that are made into wood pellets that can be used to generate electricity. For example, in the UK, you have large power plants that are based on burning wood pellets. We can also make biochemicals from a lot of these feedstocks. So we need to take into account competition. HEFA, sorry, someone has asked, what does HEFA stand for? It is hydrotreated esters and fatty acids. In the EU, they also refer to this pathway as hydrotreated vegetable oils. So sorry for that. I kind of assume sometimes that people have the background. So oils, let's look at oils and fats feedstocks only. So the HEFA pathway is currently the only fully commercial technology. You can use any form of fats, oils, and greases, and then it's upgraded through adding hydrogen through a hydrotreatment process. And usually when you want to produce SAF, you also need to perhaps have a hydrocracking process in place and an isomerization, which is making branches of the molecules so that you can meet the freeze point specifications. And you generally make more than one product, and that's important to understand. So the chemistry of oils and fats are relatively simple, and this is one of the reasons why it's the only commercial production technology at the moment. So when you look at oils and fats, you're either talking about triglycerides, which is in vegetable oils, and so you have these long carbon chains, and then you have the oxygen here at the end. And when you make biodiesel, for example, you remove this part and it becomes glycerol. But when you hydrotreat it to make a renewable diesel or SAF, then this becomes propane. So you produce these long chains and you produce propane. And when we look at different sources of these oils and fats. We also distinguish between what we call saturated fats and unsaturated fats. So we know when we buy margarine or whatever that we want polyunsaturated, and it means basically that you have these double bonds in the structure. And what this means from a feedstock perspective is that here you have to add hydrogen to remove that double bond, and here you don't. You only add hydrogen to remove that. So this feedstock will use less hydrogen than that. So if you are working for a SAF producer, you have to understand that this will impact it. And then we also get what we call free fatty acids. So this is a triglyceride, but this is a free fatty acid. And what it means is, I said this group here is a carboxylic acid. So it's an acid. So the minute you talk about an acid, you're talking about the pH. So the free fatty acids also have a lower pH than the triglyceride, and I'll show you why that's important. So we get different types of crops that we can use for oils and fats. Yeah, we have some examples: palm oil, soybean, canola, or rapeseed, the same thing, coconut oil, sunflower oil, peanut oil. And as I said, all of them have a high energy density. And so what I'm going to look at is grouping them together. The one is crops, the next one is waste, and the other one is what I would call emerging feedstocks. So generally non-edible oils and fats that has higher sustainability characteristics. So the oil seed specifically, I think what is really important to understand is that the oil is only one part of the seed. So we harvest the seeds, but then they are crushed, and a part of it is oil, and the rest is really protein. And so when we crush these oil seeds, we produce two products. We produce the oil, and then we produce the protein. And usually the protein is sold for animal feed. So, although we talk about these oilseed crops and we shouldn't use them because it's competition for food, we have to understand that there's a twofold thing. And even if you use the oil for making biofuels, you are still producing a feed co-product. And in the case of soybean, of course, the protein is sold for human consumption. And when we look at certain of these, the oil contents differ for all of these. And when we look at soybeans, the oil content is actually quite a small amount. So when you harvest the oil seeds, but then talking about the supply chain, the first thing is you need a crushing facility. So you need infrastructure for that. This is where the oil is separated from the protein. The protein is used as a co-product. And this is also a really important issue, because when you have co-products that you can sell, it improves the financial viability of a project and also reduces the life cycle carbon intensity. So when we think of using crop-based oils for SAF, we have established crops with optimized characteristics. So through genetics and breeding over decades and decades, these are optimized plants, and we can keep on increasing the yields, not through genetic modification even, just through normal breeding, that you can improve the seed to increase yields on the same size land. It's extensively cultivated already. There's established markets and trade flows. It's available in large volumes, so that the total oils crop-based oils produced globally is about 220 million metric tons. There are established supply chains, crushing, processing facilities, and you get high-value co-products because these co-products have to be approved in the US, for example, by the Food and Drug Administration, and you can't sell it unless it's already been approved. The other thing is also that the chemistry is really simple, and all of these oils and fats have basically the same chemistry, which makes it so much easier to build facilities and to process it. And also, they contain only about 11% oxygen. So it means that you don't need a lot of hydrogen, and hydrogen's expensive when you want to make SAF. If you look at, say, forest residues or agricultural residues, you can get like 45% oxygen. So oils and fats have really low oxygen, and it makes it much easier and cheaper to produce SAF. But the disadvantage is, first of all, competition with food, although there isn't really competition with animal feed, because that will still be available, and the high prices. This is just a graph from S&P Global Platts showing the price of some of these oils and fats. Here we've got crude palm oil in Indonesia, soybean oil from Argentina, and sunflower oil in the Ukraine. And the dates here, but you can see the price keeps going up, and partly it's because there's more competition. Plus, it sort of tracks the price of fossil crude. So when crude oil goes up, the prices of these, there is a perception that these prices go up because we use it for biofuel, but it actually tracks the crude oil prices. And when we look at the oils and fats for production of SAF, the cost of the feedstock is about 80% of the final cost of the SAF. So these prices have a huge impact on the final selling price of the SAF. And whereas in the case of, say, forest residues or agricultural residues, you will not see this kind of thing. It's not linked to the price of crude oil. It's a lot more stable, even though it's not such a good feedstock. Sustainability can be an issue. There can be depending on the type of crop, there can be a high water demand. There can be potential land use change issues, and of course the issue of palm oil and destruction of forest and draining of peat areas. These can all impact the sustainability. And there is the perception that they only give limited GHG emission reductions, but this is not always the case. It's not as good as feedstocks such as if you gasify forest residues, but they can give some carbon intensity reductions. But there's a big public perception issue about using crop-based feedstocks. Of course, there's also a lot of competition for use with road transport, such as biodiesel or renewable diesel. Then we get waste fats and oils, and there's a whole variety. Used cooking oil, tallow, brown grease. Brown grease is often taken from restaurant traps, where the fats are collected so that it doesn't go into the sewage system. Here, for example, it shows you what they call these fat bergs. So the fats actually stick to the sides of the pipes, underground pipes, and is a huge problem in terms of blocking up the pipes. So they're even investigating that. Of course, it has to be removed, and it's really bad quality. Then you also get palm oil mill effluent, corn oil, which is from corn production and corn ethanol production. And then you get something called tall oil, which is not commonly known. Tall oil is actually a waste product from the kraft pulping process. So it's softwoods, and you will get tall oil produced in the northern regions where you get softwood such as pine, spruce, etc. So you get tall oil produced in Canada, Finland, etc. And there's a facility in Sweden that has been using tall oil for making biofuels for the last 15 years already. Even animal fats called tallow, there are different categories depending on, so category 1 and 2, and this is based on the EU classification. So you get category 3 that is still fit for animal and nutrition, but category 1 and 2 represent a risk for human health. And in Europe, you can't use category 3 for biofuel production. But in, say, the US, they don't distinguish between these. You can use tallow. So the fats are sort of cooked to extract the oil and then divided into these categories. So there's quite a big difference between fats and oils. First one is fats are saturated. Basically, it means if you think of fats, if you cook it, it's liquid, but if it cools down, it's solid. And the reason for that is that there are no double bonds in the molecules. So you need less hydrogen, and therefore it will be cheaper to upgrade. Whereas unsaturated fats such as canola oil and so on will need more hydrogen, because every single double bond has to be removed if you're making jet fuel. And so whatever you put into your facility, you have to understand how much hydrogen you're going to use in order to meet the specifications. But what's really important also is that if you have fats, they will be solid at room temperature, whereas unsaturated oils will be liquid at room temperature. So if you are using fats in your SAF facility, it means you will need tanks that are heated, and you will need pipes that are heated. Otherwise, you won't be able to pump it. So advantages and disadvantages of using waste oils. Obviously, it has a very low carbon intensity. If you're looking at used cooking oil, it's basically, because it's a waste, it starts off with a 0 carbon intensity, and then it's only the cost of transporting it and the cost of processing it into SAF that is counted as the carbon intensity. With fats from animal fats, if you turn that into oils as a feedstock, there's some carbon intensity based on the rendering process. So it is not quite as good as used cooking oil, but it's still pretty good. So they started using these feedstocks because it had a very low cost, because it was a waste. But these days, there's such a demand for it that it's no longer low cost. And I know not too long ago in Europe, the price of used cooking oil actually was higher than the price of rapeseed. So because of this demand. Disadvantages of using this is that there are limited availability, and I'll look at the volumes that are considered globally available. Because the availability is also static, relatively static. It's based on cooking with oil, and therefore the only increase will really be based on an increase in the population. But it's not as though you're going to start using more or cook with more oil. Same thing for meat production. It's relatively static. It's not something where the yield is going to increase. So there used to be a lack of established supply chains. For example, collection of used cooking oil doesn't take place everywhere, mainly in larger cities. But this is fast changing because, of course, there's now a demand for this. So people that are collecting this can actually sell it, but mainly they collect it from, say, restaurants and so on. There aren't really systems for collecting it from households. But these feedstocks, these feedstocks, are more contaminated than vegetable oils. and therefore need more cleanup and more pre-treatment in order to use them. Then you have this category, which I call emerging lipid feedstocks, because they are not established and they're not available commercially. And so here we see Salicornia, which is a type of, it's not a succulent, but it grows in say salt water, like estuaries and stuff, so it can tolerate poor growing conditions. This has been explored in areas such as the Middle East. Algal oils, algae can produce these little fat molecules or inside the cells. You get Pongamia tree oil, so it's harvesting the seeds. You get Ethiopian mustard seeds called Brassica carinata, usually referred to as carinata. You get camelina or false flax. This is a Solaris tobacco. So it's a tobacco plant that doesn't have nicotine, and you can harvest the seeds and crush it to get oil. Jatropha is also another feedstock that has been talked about quite a lot. So advantages and disadvantages. A lot of these feedstocks are said to be able to grow on marginal lands, so contaminated or very low nutrient soils. So it can also be grown as an intermediate or cover crop on fallow lands, or as a second crop where there are longer growing seasons. It has a low carbon intensity, especially if you grow it as a cover crop, or if you use a low on marginal land or unused land. It doesn't have induced land use change, so you can get a low carbon intensity. So this can be very sustainable. But the challenges really is actually getting farmers to grow these crops. It's kind of a chicken and egg situation. The farmers can maybe grow it, but they won't grow it unless they actually have an established market. And if there's no established market, it becomes difficult. So you can give, say, subsidies to farmers to grow these crops, but you need to sort of create the whole supply chain. You need to create the demand. And for example, I said with our regular crop-based oils, you need crushing facilities. And similarly, you need crushing facilities for these seeds. And in some cases, you may have to build separate crushing facilities depending on the type of seed. Co-products, as I said, this is critical for reducing the carbon intensity, but also for making the economics work, because you can sell the meal as an animal feed, and that will give you a separate income. But when you look at seeds like Jatropha, the meal is actually toxic to animals, and although you can detoxify it, every extra thing that you do will obviously make it cost more. So this will impact the economics quite a bit, as well as the carbon intensity, and I'll show you that probably tomorrow. So there are many companies that you can find online that actually have developed seeds, and there are many attempts at establishing some of these crops. Jatropha, for example, 10 years ago already they were talking about Jatropha is the next big thing. And in China, for example, 10 years ago, they were giving farmers big subsidies to plant some of these oilseed trees, but it wasn't successful. And when we talk about marginal lands, everybody's saying, well, marginal lands, we can grow it on marginal lands. But the reality is that they might be able to grow there, but I question what are the yields you're going to get on marginal lands or degraded soils. Are you going to have to add a lot of fertilizer to get the yields? And yields are critical for the economics. If you have to get harvesting equipment and so on, the yield is important. And if you have low yields, it's going to be more expensive to produce these crops. So although, yes, there is this potential I think we have to really look at the economics, and there's not that much information around there, because a lot of these companies, they will give you data on production and yield, but you have to ask yourself, did they actually develop those yields and data on normal land that was fertile, or did they actually grow it on these really, really poor quality soils? And what was the difference? Then cover crops, I'm going to treat as a category on their own, because I think there's a huge opportunity for cover crops. They can give you substantial emission reductions, particularly as a secondary crop, because there's no induced land use change. And when I show you some of the CORSIA default values tomorrow, you will also see that it can get negative carbon ILOC values, because there's a soil carbon sequestration. It adds more organic content to the soil, and therefore it stores carbon. It can be grown on arable land, marginal land, or as a secondary crop. But I think the biggest potential that I think is there is for a secondary crop. So you grow your soybeans, and then you grow your secondary crop. So basically on the same piece of land, you get two different crops. And I think, so choosing a specific crop, you have to look at the climate, for example. So in cold climates, there's not a long enough season to really grow a second crop. And you need to look at the yield of seed per area, the yield of oil and seed, and the approval of meal as an animal feed. So this shows you this is from some US labs, and it just shows you the different yields that you could get per acre. And this is the three biggest cover crops that are considered for planting in the US: pennycress, carinata, and camelina. But there are challenges in establishing commercial production of these new crops, because this is not a commodity yet. It's a novel feedstock, and to establish large-scale planting of these crops, you have to get the farmers to actually buy into this. You also need to make sure that the meals are approved for animal feed, so that you can get value from selling the meal as a co-product. But farmers are generally quite reluctant to make changes and try new things. There are, for example, concerns about potential negative impacts on the primary cash crop following these cover crops. For example, is it going to affect the yield of your main crop? Because if you have a harvest from that crop, you've got established supply chains, you're going to sell it, this is how much you're going to get. So if you now get a lower yield, that places the farmer at risk. Also, the farmer will need to incur additional costs due to extra labor, fertilizer, energy requirements associated with planting, managing, and harvesting. And if there are no monetary incentives to encourage farmers to plant these cover crops, that may also, be a problem. There are also supply chain issues, as I explained. Supply chain means you also need the crushing facilities, and although there are crushing facilities for existing crops like soybeans or canola or rapeseed, the seeds are not the same. So you might need separate crushing facilities. And what we see recently, this company is building a new oilseed processing plant in order to start processing these other seeds, or you need to convert it, because like a soybean is a hard seed. Some of these cover crops would be a soft seed. So you can't just use the same equipment. And if you look at something like jatropha, where the protein meal is toxic, if you're producing a food grade oil, you might not want to put in a different product that might contaminate your main crushing oil. So these are all things that need to be considered. And if you look at perennials, so we looked at the cover crops, which can be grown on a annual basis, but perennials such as your oilseed trees, the pongamia that I showed you, and the jatropha, it might take 3, 4, 5 years before you get your first crop. So this is a huge risk for a farmer to plant these when you're not sure there's a market, or you're not sure how fast you're going to make any money from this. And this is what happened in China, is they gave these subsidies, but it takes so long for these trees to start producing commercial crops, and that makes it quite difficult. And then algae, a lot of people talk about algae, and in fact 10, 15 years ago they said algae was the next best thing for making biofuels. So you get two different types of algae, microalgae and macroalgae. So these are your microalgae, whereas macroalgae would be more like seaweeds and stuff. So the microalgae produce these, they call it vesicles, inside the cells with a very high oil content. And if you can extract that, you can make SAF through the HEFA process. However, commercial production has had many challenges. And 10, 15 years ago, there were a lot of companies that were starting up, and they were going to make SAF. But the problem is that making it is very, very expensive. So the algae can be grown in these sort of tubes, or in areas such as California, Arizona, wherever they look at growing them, what they call in these raceway ponds, that you can have acres and acres of these ponds. So of course you can realize that this is more expensive than this. But the other big thing is you grow it in water. And the big thing is now you have to extract all the water in order to get the algal cells, and then you have to extract the oils from them. And that is one of the more expensive parts of the process, how to actually remove all the water before you can extract. So generally, if you compare the cost of different types of oil sources, algal oils are very, very expensive. And the other issue is that companies can sell products such as spirulina. They can make essential fatty acids that they can sell into the supplement market and so on. And these have a much higher value, and you don't need a massive, large-scale facility. So there has been a lot of challenges with doing algae and producing these oils. So a lot of people, a lot of reports are still saying this is a fantastic opportunity, but the cost is always going to be critical. So, and of course the climate, they tried it here in Canada. I know some companies, but of course then you have to keep heating it. So that was microalgae. Macroalgae doesn't really produce oils within their cells, but it's got a high carbohydrate content. So you will see that there are companies looking at using seaweed and so on. You can also, in the technology hydrothermal liquefaction, you can use the whole biomass. You don't have to just extract the oils. You can use the whole cell. So there are different ways of trying to use it, but the economics have not worked. So let's just look at feedstock contaminants and pretreatments. This is quite important. When we talk about any bio-based feedstocks, we have to realize that just like in our bodies, as these things grow, they need the enzymes, need phosphorus, magnesium, potassium, sulfur, nitrogen, all the biochemical processes that take place in plants and need these types of alkali metals. And all of these have to be removed because if you put it through a hydrotreatment process, this uses catalysts, and all of these will poison the catalysts because they will bind to the catalysts, and then it's pretty useless. So pre-treatment has to be carried out that can actually remove all of these compounds, and some of the pre-treatment steps would be, for example, acid degumming, filtration, and so on. So nitrogen and sulfur, you actually get that in crude oils. So that's not really an issue. It doesn't bind to the catalyst, but it's removed as part of the hydrotreatment process. But the percentage nitrogen and sulfur will be important because the more nitrogen and sulfur you have, the more hydrogen you will use. So, and the more hydrogen you use, the more expensive the process becomes. And what you can also do in a biorefinery is you put a guard bed just before your hydroprocessing reactor, and then any metals that are still remaining will bind to this guard bed, and you can just replace the guard bed so that your main reactor catalyst is not affected. But then you have waste oils such as used cooking oil. Of course, you're frying food in that, so you get contaminants such as proteins, residues. You might get things, solid particles like bits of fried food floating in it. So filtration and so on, removing some of these proteins. And so waste oils generally require more pre-treatment than vegetable oils, and that makes it more expensive. There are some, and the other thing is when you do acid degumming or filtration, you actually lose some of your oils and fats in there. So it reduces your yields and therefore affect the economics. So there are new types of pre-treatment available that tries to, I think, reduce the yield loss and actually have a more successful removal of these compounds. And the other contaminant that I just want to mention is the free fatty acids. So I talked about that right in the beginning when I looked at the chemistry. So vegetable oils mainly have the triglycerides, whereas used cooking oil and so on have free fatty acids. So suddenly you have a lower pH feedstock, and this can actually affect the metal piping, your pumps, your storage tanks, everything that you're using, because you need a metal that can resist corrosion, and that makes it more expensive again. So you have to understand how these feedstock contaminants will affect your process. So this is an interesting, and if you're interested in contaminants, this company, Desmet Ballastra, they published this little article that you can go look at there, and they are a company specializing in pre-treatment steps. And so the data that they gave in this little article shows you different types of feedstocks. This FFA stands for free fatty acids, and you see here animal fats have very high, palm fatty acid distillates have very high, used cooking oils are quite high, edible vegetables very low. So phosphorus, P, and again you can see the difference here. Other metals or total metals, you can see here again, animal fats have incredibly high metal content, nitrogen, sulfur, chlorine. That's also important. What we don't realize is, for example, animal fats might come from, food that has been packaged and so on. So you might even get plastics there and chlorine from other sources. Plastics, polyethylene. So again, here you see there might be plastic that got into your used cooking oil or in your animal fats. So depending on the feedstock, you have to understand what is in there and how to remove it if you're going to produce SAF. And as biorefineries are looking at using more and more of these waste feedstocks in order to uh, have a lower carbon intensity SAF production. Before, they used to just buy the already cleaned up feedstock. But what we see is that now biorefineries are starting to build their own pretreatment facilities, and that requires additional infrastructure and greater investment. So you need to understand the feedstocks in order to know how you will build your facility and what you're going to need. And every refinery has specific limits, quality parameters. I'm not going to go into great detail here, but they set the standard so they know exactly what they can tolerate in terms of their process. So when we look at considerations for feedstock selection for our HEFA pathway, cost is going to be a huge consideration because it's about 80% of the production cost of your SAF. You need to, when you build a facility, you need to know that you're going to have sufficient feedstock availability and supply for the next 20 years. You need to understand the sustainability. You need to understand the quality and the cost of pretreatment. When you look at emerging feedstocks, some biorefineries or SAF refineries are now starting to say invest in companies that are planting these types of cover crops and so on to get their own supply chain. Because you can go and buy oils on the market, but then you have no control over the availability or the price. But if you invest in a company that is in agriculture and you look at planting your own facility, cultivating your own feedstock and building your own crushing facility, then you have a secure supply chain. So this is what we see happening. There are many companies all over the world. Neste is a company, ST1 in Sweden, and they are actually buying used collection oil companies so that they can ensure that they're going to get a supply for their SAF refineries. And the bigger the refinery, if you're starting to look at billion liters, it might be difficult to source used cooking oil and animal fats. So it's likely that the bigger the facility, the more they might have to start looking at vegetable oil feedstocks. And, as I said, biofuel companies are increasing investment into feedstocks. For example, used cooking oil. Here, this company ENI is based in Italy, and they are now investing in companies in Africa to grow their own feedstock there. Same with BP and so on. So it's a completely different approach to fuel production, biofuel production. This is just another few graphs looking at feedstocks. As I said, it's about 70 to 80% of the operating cost, and there's huge variability the whole time. I think I mentioned already that, jet fuel molecules, you need between 8 and 16 carbons in your molecule. But when you look here at different types of oil feedstocks, you will see what here is 16, there's 16 carbons, 18 carbons. And so the majority of these feedstocks have carbon chains of 18. There's a few where the majority falls around 16. So basically, the majority of the fatty acids in these vegetable oils have 18 carbons, which mean they fall outside the range for jet fuel. And so if you want to make jet fuel from these fatty acids, you need to reduce the number of carbons so that you can get more SAF. I'm going to just explain that in a minute. I just want to see. So Regina asked, what's the main feedstock used by these big companies, Neste, ENI, BP, Bunge, Chevron? So a lot of them will tell you that they use only waste feedstocks, but most of them will use a mixture of feedstocks. But, there is this public perception of not using crops. So definitely Chevron, Bunge uses soybean, and they will use a combination of different feedstocks. I'll be surprised if any of them use purely just waste feedstocks. Yeah. So, as I explained, your oils and fats do not naturally have the right carbon length to make SAF. Most of these molecules fall in the diesel range. So when we look at a refinery, if you just hydrotreat your oils and fats, you basically will get molecules that are outside of the jet range. And so in a refinery, what you will see is that they use a distillation process to separate the different products. So here, if you look here at carbon number, this is gasoline, this is jet fuel, and this is diesel. I know this is sort of complicated, but it's important to understand. So if you have a mixture of molecules, you can make gasoline and diesel only. You don't have to make jet fuel ever. It depends on how you're going to make the most money. So if you want to make jet fuel, you now have to say, have a cutoff point there and a cutoff point there. So then you make 3 different products. So the refinery chooses that cutoff point depending on what they want to make and what's going to make them the most money. So because your oils and fats naturally fall in this range, the only way that you can make more SAF is to break these molecules up into smaller molecules. And that requires more processing, and we use a step called hydrocracking that cracks the molecules. But what happens then is it's like breaking spaghetti. You can't break it precisely. So you get large pieces, you get tiny pieces, and pieces in between. And the small pieces are gases. And gases are not that valuable. So now you are actually reducing the yield of your valuable products, while you have to spend more money on building an additional processing unit. And now if you want to make SAF, you need to meet very low freeze point specifications, which you don't need for renewable diesel. If you want to go sell renewable diesel up in Norway in the middle of winter, then you need this level of freeze point. But for most renewable diesel, you don't need that level of freeze point. So if you want to make SAF, you have to now crack these molecules into shorter molecules, and then you also need to isomerize them so that you can meet this low freeze point. So that the takeaway, the conclusion is, it is more expensive to make SAF rather than just renewable diesel. And that's a problem, because if the refinery can choose which products they make, why would they choose to make SAF if it's more expensive to make it, unless they can sell it for more? And that doesn't happen. You cannot sell the SAF for more than what you can sell the renewable diesel, unless there are policies to make this possible. So that's a really important issue, because what we see all around the world is that there are a lot of facilities that use vegetable oils and fats and use cooking oils and everything, but they only make renewable diesel. They don't make SAF. And this is the reason why. It's because you have to do more processing, you lose some of your yield, and you can't get a higher price. In fact, jet fuel is normally at a lower price than diesel. So that is quite a complicated issue, and is one of the biggest challenges when we want to make more SAF from these products. If we look at, say, 3-4 years ago, globally they were producing about 7 billion liters of renewable diesel through the HEFA pathway, but there was not more than 100 million liters of SAF being produced. And this is the reason why, because it's more expensive to produce the SAF, and you can't get a good price for it. Part of it is a policy issue. So there's a question here: why can't they naturally sell SAF at a higher rate than renewable diesel if the feedstock and production cost is higher? Well, a big part of it is the fact that you can get incentives in many places for renewable diesel, but there are no incentives for SAF. So if you look at in the US, and there's a policy course that I'm also doing in a couple of weeks' time. If you attend that, I sort of reiterate some of that. SAF has to compete with renewable diesel, and basically, who can pay the highest price? If somebody will pay for the renewable diesel, but they won't pay for the SAF, then you will sell it for renewable diesel. It's not as simple as, okay, we're just going to charge more. If you sell renewable diesel, or you make renewable diesel and you want to sell it in the US, you can get incentives under the renewable fuel standard, and then you can sell it in California and you can get incentives there. And because the energy density of the renewable diesel is greater than the energy density of the SAF, the incentives are higher. So that's basically why. So unless there is policy that gives SAF a higher incentive, it's not going to actually make more. Okay, so let's switch to lignocellulose feedstocks, biomass, and here we're looking at forest residues, agricultural residues, and municipal solid waste. So the main way that we're looking at it, excuse me. The main pathways that we look at here is thermochemical conversion, such as gasification, pyrolysis, hydrothermal liquefaction. And you can take the gasified feedstock, use Fischer-Tropsch synthesis, or you can make methanol, ethanol plus alcohol to jet. And with the pyrolysis, hydrothermal liquefaction, you can upgrade it through hydrotreatment and so on. You can also break it down into sugars, and then you can ferment those into alcohols or hydrocarbons to make SAF. So there are various pathways, but this is the main pathway that we are looking at. So back to some chemistry, but it's just really to help you understand, because this is quite important. If we look at the say a forest or wood, the plant cells contain lignocellulose. That's why we call it lignocellulose feedstocks. And what you have here is cellulose here in the middle, and the cellulose is surrounded by hemicellulose, and lignin. So the cellulose is the main component when we're looking at extracting sugars for fermentation. The cellulose, these are glucose molecules. So we can, by breaking these bonds, we make glucose, and that's simple. We know that for thousands of years, you can take sugar and add yeast, and then you make alcohol. That's the basic process, and it's really, really simple. And so your yeast can use these molecules. Hemicellulose, these are also called sugars, but it's a lot more complicated because you have 5 carbon sugars and all sorts of complicated structures. So you can break all of these different bonds, but your normal yeast cannot use these sugars. And then you also have lignin. So this is what makes the plant stand upright. Without lignin, a plant will just flop over. So the bigger the plant, the more lignin it needs. But the lignin has got no sugar in it at all. And if you look at biochemical methods, you can't use the lignin at all to make ethanol. You mainly use this, and if you have a yeast or something specially adapted, you can also use that, but you can't use this. And every type of feedstock has a different composition when it comes to these 3 categories. So, and what we see is, like, say, sugarcane bagasse, 42%, softwood, so pine will have 45 to 50% cellulose, etc., etc. Rice straw only has 32% cellulose. So this is all really, really important to understand, that if you're going to use a biochemical method, you're interested mainly in these sugars, but this can be a really small component of your feedstock. And sometimes you can use this, but you have this huge component that you can't really use to make SAF unless you use a separate process. So I'm going to come back to that again. So when we look at lignocellulose, we have trees, forest. So I'm going to explain to you here. This is forestry based on the northern hemisphere, the boreal forest that you will get like in Canada and Norway, Sweden, Finland, and so on. So this is softwood, and it's so pine, spruce, all of those types of wood. So the first thing is what they call, there's a cascading use. You never want to use the trees for making SAF. You cut the trees and you use it to make wood that you can build with, and that's a form of carbon storage in effect. And then what they do in the forest is they are not really interested in taking the branches and the tops. They cut the tops off, they cut the branches off, and they remove the logs, and that's what they take to the sawmill, where they cut it up in lumber. The branches and the side and the top stay behind after the logging. And this is what we are interested in, not the whole trees. But the other thing is, then this is transported to the sawmill where it's cut up, and at the sawmill you get the wood that you can use to make furniture or build houses. Then you get wood chips. So they are pieces that you can't cut lumber from, and that you can use to make wood chips, which you can send to a pulp mill to make paper or cardboard or whatever. We don't read newspapers anymore, but Amazon uses a lot of cardboard, so we still need pulp mills. Then you get sawdust that is formed there, and then you get shavings from, say, planing, and you also get bark. So this is basically the composition of that tree. So we are interested in this, and we are interested in is the waste. And these form two separate categories. So if you want to make SAF from this would be your perfect feedstock because it's already here at the sawmill in a large quantity. It's already small sizes, mostly, except the bark. So this is the best feedstock to use. But we also look at this because this is a huge feedstock availability. But the problem is this is left behind in the forest. So now you have to go and collect that and remove it and transport it to your facility. And then you still have to grind it. And you also have to dry it before you can use it. So although we talk about forest residues, we have to realize we have easy residues that's produced at the sawmill, and we have difficult residues. And for this, we need a special supply chain. For this, not so much. And that makes a big difference. So what you see is that there are companies producing wood pellets from these feedstocks mainly. And these wood pellets, as I mentioned earlier, in the UK, for example, there are policies that encourage power plants to stop using coal and rather use woody biomass, and this is what they use. So they make these in Canada, and then they export it to Japan and the UK and everywhere where it's used for power, electricity production. And the difference between this and this is that this is dry, it's compressed and densified, so you can ship this all over the world and it will be economical, but this you can't unless you turn it into that. Can you see my pointer, Regina?
No, I don't think we can see your pointer. I can't see it as well.
Oh, sorry. Let me see. Oh, that's too small. Sorry, I've been using the pointer thinking that you can see it. Can you see that?
No.
Okay. Can you see that?
Yes.
Hmm. Let me just see.
Something that
Yeah. I've got the pointer on, but I don't know why you can't see it.
we can see that now.
Can you? Okay. So so what I said is this is your perfect feedstock. This one will be more expensive because you have to remove it from the forest, dry it, grind it. So this is a great feedstock because you can transport it very far. You won't be limited to transporting it within 100 kilometers. This one, definitely, you can't take it more than 100 kilometers, then it becomes too expensive. The problem is you might be able to get this at $60 per ton, but this is like selling in the UK for like $160 per ton. So it will make a big difference in terms of the price of your SAF. Remember, the feedstock has a huge impact on the production cost. So when we look at forest residues, this is one of the biggest amounts of feedstocks that is available everywhere in the world. And it's in every country, so meaning that you can probably build a SAF facility based on this feedstock in most countries. It's also a waste feedstock, and it's very sustainable. And if you use gasification, for example, it's one of the lowest carbon intensity. So your sawmill residues are actually the perfect feedstock because it's already dry, it's already small particles, and it was transported there as part of the wood. So you don't have to transport it very far, and it's already, because it's ground fine, you can get more into a truck, for example. So it's very cheap, but where they are using it for wood pellets, they can get a higher price for the pellets in other countries, such as the UK, because of policy there. And what we see in Canada, for example, is let me just explain to you. So in Canada, what used to happen is that the forest company will take the wood and they will leave this behind, and then come winter, they burn it because they're not allowed to just leave it there, they burn it. But the problem now with wildfires in Canada, which you may have seen on the news, last year, wildfires in Canada released 3 times more emissions than for the whole of Canada based on industry and human activity. So it's a massive problem. So they're trying to put policies in place to encourage the use of this for more other applications, so that it doesn't stay behind and that you reduce the amount of carbon that stay behind in the forest. But this is not necessarily the case in all countries. So it's really important. You need to leave some behind for soil carbon, but you not too much. I read the other day, for example, that in Germany, the forests are not storing carbon anymore, because if you just leave all the wood there, the dead wood, they get degraded by microorganisms, and the degradation process releases carbon as well. So what we have to understand is that there are reasons why we need to use these residues, even though it goes hand in hand with logging. The problem with forest residues is that they are generated in the forest where the logging takes place, and often this is very far from the refinery or other supply chains. It's a low energy density and not economical to transport. It's got a high water content, and it also needs drying, which has a requirement for energy input, and that reduces the carbon intensity. Well, increases the carbon intensity. It reduces the potential emission reduction. You also need to grind it, and grinding takes a lot of energy. And then you need to put in place supply chains for harvesting, collection, size reduction, and transport to refineries. So you can remove the wood with this kind of thing, but you need a completely different type of truck to take residues out. And all of these extra steps contribute to GHG emissions. Then looking at the agricultural residues. So here we, for example, look at corn stover, wheat straw, rice straw, which remain on the field after the crop has been harvested. So some residues have to be left behind to restore carbon to the soil, but the rest has a limited purpose, and most can be sustainably removed. And in many countries, they actually just burn this on the field. For example, with rice production, because they want to plant immediately again after the harvest, they just burn the residues. In Denmark, they've been using wheat straw residues for a long time already in power production, and there's some competition using it for animal bedding, but there's still substantial volumes available that we can potentially use for SAF production. It's a significant source of feedstock, and it's a waste. So you can use it in thermochemical technologies such as gasification, pyrolysis, and hydrothermal liquefaction, but it can also be used in biochemical technologies for production of ethanol, which can be converted into SAF, or second generation or cellulosic ethanol. But I think what is important with these residues, both from the forest and from agriculture, is that these technologies are not commercial. There's no SAF technology based on these feedstocks that are commercial. We can generate heat and power from it, but we can't actually make fuel from it yet. And agricultural residues are in a separate category because it's more challenging than forest residues. The first thing, it's got a high ash content or mineral content. And that basically, if you make a fire, the ash stays behind. And that's basically the non-carbon. So it's all the minerals from the plant, like the phosphorus, the magnesium, the potassium, all of those things that you need in a growing organism. So that stays behind when you make a fire. So when you want to use these residues, forest residues have less than 2% ash, but agricultural residues have a much higher ash content. And this makes it more abrasive. So if you are using it in equipment, it will actually grind it down, cause damage. The other thing about these residues is that they generated over a very short period at harvest time. So you harvest your crop and now you have to go harvest all these residues within like what, a 2-week period, and you have to collect it, bale it, and you have to store it. If you're going to operate a SAF plant for a whole year based on feedstocks that you collected just in a 2-week period, you need to have storage facilities, and you have to decide, are you going to make square bales? Are you going to make round bales? What's going to be the easiest to store? And you have to realize that if you've got a stack in the field like that, as it rains, it gets into the middle there. You have microbes there that starts degrading because they can live on the agricultural residues and extract carbon for growth. But so you are reducing the content of the residues that you can use for SAF. So it will reduce the quality of the residues and also the yield of any fuel that you make. It can also, if you have lightning strikes, you can get your stacks burning down. And the quality of your feedstock is determined by collection and baling methods. So if you come across on the ground and you're collecting all these residues, you might be sucking up stones and rocks and sand or any other garbage that is lying around blue there. And all of this can damage your equipment when you bring it into your biorefinery. And so these residues can be used for cellulosic ethanol or second generation ethanol. But this is actually very complicated and is not really a fully commercial type of technology. So it's very sustainable and you can get large emission reductions. But it's very difficult to make it. And it's very expensive to make. So when I started doing these courses, there was a facility in Romania that used the sun-liquid process, and I put this diagram in, and then earlier this year, this facility closed down because they couldn't make it work. And that's what's been happening to facilities. I think the first cellulosic ethanol facility in the world opened in 2013 in Italy, and then there were 5 companies opening these facilities in the US, and they all closed down. They just couldn't make it work. So currently, there's a company in Brazil that is producing cellulosic ethanol. This company is called Praj, and Ryzen. And then there's a company called Praj in India looking at using wheat straw. But Ryzen is the only company that is producing this cellulosic ethanol, and they're using sugarcane bagasse, which I'm going to also talk about. So it's a very, very challenging technology, and most of them have failed. So yes, we can produce ethanol, and then we can convert that ethanol into jet fuel, but we don't have it yet. And one of the biggest issues with the cellulosic ethanol production was the supply chain and the fact that it's really, really expensive. So earlier I showed you this lignocellulosic structure and the fact that when you want to make ethanol, you can really only use the cellulose component because your normal yeast can only use those sugars. So, and there are multiple steps. And bearing in mind, the more steps you have in a process, the more expensive it becomes. So first of all, you need to collect the biomass, then you need to pre-treatment, for example, pre-treat it with, say, steam explosion. Then you need to use enzyme hydrolysis. So you have to produce the enzymes. You can use about 10 enzymes or even more than that. You have to produce the enzymes separately. Then you use enzyme hydrolysis. Then you produce glucose, and you can ferment that glucose to produce ethanol. And then you can potentially ferment pentose, the hemicellulose, 5-carbon sugars, but your normal yeast cannot do that. So this is a very complex process, which makes it very expensive and easily double or even 3 times more expensive than producing ethanol from corn, for example. I think, shall we stop here for a 5-minute break, Harry?
Yeah, sounds good. Meet back at 22 the hour.
Welcome back. We're ready to go?
Let's do it.
Let's go.
Yeah. So let's just continue with lignocellulose. So we talked about agricultural residues, but there's a specific type of agricultural residue that I want to discuss, sugarcane bagasse, which is unique in the sense that the sugarcane is harvested and the bagasse, similar to sawmill residues, is produced actually at the sugar mill. And why this is important, similar to sawmill residues, is that you don't have to go and harvest it separately. You don't have to transport it, and it's already in this size. And therefore, as a feedstock for cellulosic ethanol production, it's probably ideal. And that is why the company Ryzen in Brazil is currently producing bagasse sugarcane ethanol. Then we also get other types of crops, energy crops. So first of all, we've got these trees, poplar and willow, and these are also called short rotation coppice. And they can be cut, I think, several years. I don't know how many, 5, 6, 7 years in a row. You can cut them and use the wood. And this is, for example, what they use in Brazil, as well as in the US Southeast, where they make wood pellets from this. So because it can be cut over and over again, unlike pine and so on, which you can't do the same. Then you get these 2 energy crops called miscanthus and switchgrass, and as you can see, these are gigantic plants, and there are companies that are looking at using this for production of SAF. I know all the renewables, DG Fuels, are looking at these And again, they can be harvested and regrow. It's not like a crop that you have to keep planting. So it gives you a really good carbon intensity. And then looking at municipal solid waste. So you can use this for gasification mainly, but what they also do in some areas is, as the garbage in the landfill starts degrading, it produces methane. So this can be collected as a biogas. But for purposes of SAF production, we mainly look at gasification. So this is cheap, but not free. And a lot of the cost would be sorting and processing. You have to remove any recyclable material. And of course, there's contaminants. You might get glass, metals, batteries, all sorts of things that can be really detrimental to any gasification or SAF production facility. You obviously also have to reduce the size. It would be limited to large urban areas, but it's very sustainable because it's a waste and you are avoiding methane emissions. So if it's just in the landfill, as I said, it will degrade and produce methane, and methane is actually worse than carbon dioxide from an environmental perspective. The biggest challenges is quality and cost of cleanup. And you might know that earlier this year, the first commercial scale facility that was using municipal solid waste to produce biofuels and hydrocarbon fuels and SAF closed down, and they couldn't make it work. They hardly produced anything. And the big problem was probably the feedstock. It's not really, there's not a lot of information known about this. But it's very complicated. This particular company, for example, because of this complicated mixture of stuff, they had formation of nitric acid that actually corroded the metals in the pipes and the pumps and everything. So they had to replace all of that. And because this is such a complex and unknown feedstock with so many contaminants, it's difficult to predict what might happen. So the cost of cleanup and the quality is huge. Then we can also use sewage sludge and other wastes. For example, vegetable waste. If you think of juice plants, you will get fruit waste, all sorts of different things, bakery waste, brewery waste. So all of this can be used with one technology, hydrothermal liquefaction, because a lot of these have got high water content, and hydrothermal liquefaction uses wet waste. It has a low energy density, so must be used within a close proximity. But usually, especially from sludge and some of these other ones, you can get a very high nitrogen content, and this has to be removed, but you will need a lot more hydrogen, which makes it more expensive. This process is also not ASTM approved. Then in the EU, under recycled carbon fuels, you can also use plastic waste for SAF production. And I just briefly wanted to mention this. So you can obviously use gasification, but they're also looking at technologies such as pyrolysis or hydrothermal liquefaction. So you make a bio-oil or a bio-crude that you can then upgrade through hydrotreatment. So if you use it to make new building blocks for plastics, that's part of a circular economy. But if you make fuel, the carbon is released into the atmosphere upon fuel combustion. So it can give you a low carbon alternative, but it depends on the disposal method. So in the EU, the alternative is to incinerate the waste, and that is far more emission intensive, and therefore using plastic waste can be beneficial, but this is not necessarily the case everywhere. So this is a EU-specific issue. If you look at CORSIA, they only look at the carbon 14 content. So only the renewable carbon will count towards the carbon intensity. So then looking at sugar and starch feedstocks, which we mainly will use for production of ethanol, for example. So the sugar and starch, we can have a fermentation process using yeast, which has been used for thousands of years. So you can, for ethanol production, you can also get other types of yeast that can produce isobutanol or just butanol. And you can also get other types of microorganisms that can produce hydrocarbons, such as other fatty acids, or farnesene, which is a 15-carbon molecule that can be upgraded to SAF. When you produce an alcohol, you would use an alcohol-to-jet process to produce SAF. So this is just some of the sugar and starch feedstocks. This is cassava. This is sugar beets, wheat, etc. So there's a lot of different feedstocks. Now, we already produce a lot of ethanol globally because of policies that make it compulsory to blend ethanol into gasoline. So we already have 120 billion liters of ethanol produced globally, and the main feedstocks used are corn, the blue one, and sugarcane in Brazil. So corn ethanol from the US is the biggest contributor to ethanol production. And the argument is, as electric vehicles become more prevalent, we will use less gasoline, so there can be a lot of ethanol already used for fuel purposes that can be diverted to producing SAF through an alcohol-to-jet pathway. There are also established supply chains for these transporting ethanol across the world. So these are very large volumes. It's fully commercial and can produce cheap ethanol compared to cellulosic ethanol. As I said, at least half, if not lower than cellulosic ethanol. There are concerns with the food versus fuel debate, sustainability and carbon intensity, but also similar to the oilseeds, what I want to emphasize is that, if you take corn and you produce ethanol, you also produce distillers' grains, which is sold for animal feed. In the US, for example, all the corn is used for animal feed. In other countries, it's a staple food for feeding humans, but in the US, it's mainly used for feeding animals. If you just give corn to animals, that's not really to cattle, that's not really healthy because there's too much sugar in it. So by using the corn to make ethanol, you produce distillers' grains, which you can then feed to cattle, which has a higher protein content and is actually more beneficial. And what a lot of these ethanol refineries have done is they produce multiple products. You can make corn oil. You can take the corn kernel and the inside of the cob, and you can use that, what they call making 1.5 generation ethanol, which is sort of advanced ethanol, but not quite cellulosic ethanol because it's not using the residues. So you can actually make multiple products that are very beneficial. And for example, farmers, ethanol producers in the EU, and they use sugar from sugar beet to make ethanol, and they can get like a 70% reduction in emissions from their ethanol. So you can keep optimizing it, and you can probably increase the yields of these crops. So it can be very beneficial. So the carbon intensity can actually be improved based on the process. And sugarcane ethanol already has very low carbon intensity due to various factors, renewable energy that is used, the way it's grown. It's a very, very high productivity because of the warm climates. So sugarcane ethanol has almost the same carbon intensity as cellulosic ethanol to jet. We can also use carbon dioxide and hydrogen as feedstock. So this is there's just a comment. In Brazil, cars use the ethanol directly without mixing with gasoline. Yeah, there are various options that you get flex fuel vehicles, so you can use it at 20%, 70%, 100%, depending. Yeah, but there aren't really many diesel vehicles in Brazil, and the Brazilian situation is actually quite different because they already introduced ethanol blending in the 70s, so they go way, way, way back. So CO2 and hydrogen is based on is a power to liquid or e-fuel production, but I just briefly wanted to mention a couple of things around here. Sources of CO2, of course, you can use direct air capture, and theoretically they say then you can get 100% emission reductions, but direct air capture actually uses a lot of electricity itself. Depending on the type of direct air capture, you get different types of technologies. Point source capture is where you are capturing the gas from an industrial source, such as a steel mill. So if this is originally a fossil source, of course, it doesn't have the as good a climate impact. So companies will say, oh, we use this and we reduce our fuel has an 80% reduction. But that means this company cannot claim any reductions. So you can't claim both. You get various sources: steel mills, cement production, coal-fired plants. Obviously, we don't want to use it from coal-fired plants because then you're kind of locking in the use of that unsustainable fossil fuel. But steel mill and cement production is considered almost unavoidable because there are no other options. So that's considered acceptable. But there is a potential problem, as I said, with the double counting. You cannot, for example, as a facility, claim emission reductions because your CO2 is captured, while the SAF production facility also claims the same emission reductions. So that is important to remember. Then the one I didn't mention is biogenic CO2. There's quite a lot of interest in using biogenic CO2. So if you are burning wood to make electricity, you are producing CO2 because of the combustion. So that CO2 will be a biogenic source of CO2, which is considered sustainable. Other biogenic CO2 also is if you produce ethanol, as the organism produces the ethanol, it actually gives off CO2. So if you can capture the CO2 at ethanol mills, that is a biogenic source and therefore starts with a zero emission. So that could be very sustainable. The problem is how much you produce at one place and whether it can support an e-fuel facility. And if you want to have a bigger facility, the sort of infrastructure to actually move the CO2 to a bigger facility. Then hydrogen itself, there are different sources. We call it gray hydrogen if you base it on natural gas, blue hydrogen if you have natural gas, but then using carbon capture and storage. Then green hydrogen is when you use electrolysis of water, but only if that electricity source is renewable. Of course, if the source of electricity is from coal, it's not beneficial at all, even if you use electrolysis. There's also an issue about the source of water. just to bring your attention to that, of course, if you are in a water scarce area, the use of water may impact the sustainability of the process, in spite of the fact that you might have renewable electricity and that you're using electrolysis. So you can use seawater, but then you have to actually desalinate it because you need clean water, and then you have that additional cost. Plus, then you're likely to situate your facility near the ocean, and that will, impact location and so on. There's also the whole issue of in both the UK and the EU, electricity, even if we're producing renewable electricity, it goes into the grid. But if the entire grid is not renewable, that raises some issues. So if you want to produce e-fuels from renewable electricity, and the renewable electricity is going into a grid, you can have a power purchase agreement to show that you've purchased the renewable electricity, but this will affect the grid electricity carbon intensity, and eventually what they're saying is that there will be some complex calculations that you are only allowed to claim the actual renewable electricity. This is quite complicated. I'm not going to go into it, but if you're interested in that, also CO2 sources, you can capture CO2 sources from say power stations, but it will only count as zero emissions until 2036. So they're bringing in all these different types of regulations that make it very complicated. Availability of renewable electricity could be a challenge as well. The first thing is competition. So you want to use your electricity for heat and power applications, and you want to charge electric vehicles. Because if you want to make e-fuels, it's probably the least efficient way to use your energy. If you take the electricity and you charge a battery, then it's 6 times more efficient than if you take that and make it into a power to liquid, an e-fuel. And the electricity must also be additional. So what some companies are doing are building their own renewable electricity supply. If you take it from the grid, of course, you've got a stable supply of energy. If you take it only from renewable sources that you've built, of course, there can be fluctuations. If you're only using solar, what do you do at night? Do you kind of ramp up and ramp down your production of hydrogen, or what do you do? Do you build storage, battery storage, so that you can operate 24/7? This will all impact the cost of your building your facility, and it will impact the cost of making your SAF. There's a very, very interesting paper that was published, and an article also written on this issue, that if you look at the projections for SAF, both from biomass and from e-fuels, they're saying that you will need about 9% of global renewable electricity to meet eSAF requirements, and 30% of sustainably available biomass. So the academics question whether it really makes sense, because it's important to realize making SAF is not the most efficient way of using the resources. If you just burn wood for electricity, it's actually far more efficient. You get more energy out of it than if you convert that into a fuel that then you burn later on. So let's just look at global availability of feedstocks. So there are various reports and so on that give estimates of how much SAF we will need. And it could be anything. Just this one report estimated 330 to 445 million tons. And if you convert that based on the energy density of jet fuel, which is 1,250 liters per ton. So you will need like at least 400 billion liters, and other reports, anything from 4 to 5 to 600 billion liters. So although we can reduce emissions from aviation through technology and operational improvements, SAF will need to deliver the bulk of our emission reductions. So the question in all of these reports is, do we have sufficient feedstocks for SAF production? Because this will be critical. And there are multiple reports that assess feedstock availability. You've got some general organizations such as the International Energy Agency, International Renewable Energy Agency, Energy Transition Commission, and then you get SAF-specific reports that have only considered non-food crops feedstocks. And this is the ICF report, for example, and the World Economic Forum Clean Skies for Tomorrow report. And they all give you different estimates. But I think what is important is when we look at availability, we have theoretical availability, we have technical availability, economic availability, and implementation potential availability. So theoretical is we can just add up everything that's there, but this is not actually a realistic assessment. Technical potential is what would be available under harvesting techniques, infrastructure, accessibility. So that would also be supply chains, etc., and conservation, and so on. So, but then there's also the critical issue of economic potential, because no matter what, how much we want to impact and achieve climate mitigation, the cost is always going to be an issue. You cannot go to an airline and just say, I'm going to sell you SAF, which is 4 times more expensive than another SAF, but this is a really good one. It just doesn't work like that. You have to make it economically viable. So the economic potential takes into account the cost and what would be feasible in terms of producing SAF that would be marketable, I suppose. Then the implementation potential is also what can we implement within a specific time frame and with current policy incentives. So some of the factors that impact availability, for example, we have, the actual availability versus the theoretical availability. We have to ask, what can be sustainably harvested? How much do we have to leave behind on the field or in the forest? What is the competition from other applications? Generally, you would exclude feedstocks that are already used for other applications. We also have to look at the distance from the refinery, 100, 150, maybe 200 kilometers. You also have to look at geography. You might say, okay, we have all these residues being produced, but you can't really collect it on steep slopes. That might not be viable or economical, and you have to look at the cost. So this is an example of a cost curve from the recent US billion-ton report, which assessed all of the feedstock available in the US to determine whether there's enough to produce and achieve the SAF targets that they've set. So this just shows you, first of all, the cost per ton, and then this shows you how much. So when you just want a little bit, you can access really, really cheap feedstocks. But then as you want to produce more and more and more, the feedstocks become more and more expensive. So your fats, oils, and greases are your most expensive feedstocks. But it also, this just shows you in terms of feedstock cost, but it doesn't show you the commercial technology. So this technology is commercial, but these are not commercial at all. We can't really use this yet, although it might be available at a low price. So this report from the World Economic Forum, Clean Skies for Tomorrow, was really interesting. And they said that there was more than enough feedstock to produce the 500 billion liters or whatever. The problem was that they counted feedstocks that were not actually available. They counted potential rather than actual. Some of the assessments of feedstock have some value, but others not really. So these are the valuable ones in the sense that their assessment of used cooking oil, fats, and other waste oils add to about between 30 and 40 million tons, which is kind of estimates that agree with companies such as Neste, what they've published. But they also talked about oils, lipids from oil trees and cover crops, but none of this is actually commercially available. So it doesn't make sense to cover things that are not available. So what you can see here is like these wastes, about 40 million tons, but these oil trees, 85 million tons, oil cover crops, 70 million tons, these don't exist. So it doesn't make sense to say it's available when it's actually not. Cellulosic cover crops, this is not really available either. It hasn't really been utilized, and yeah, none of this has actually got a technology that can really use it yet. The only technology that we've got can use this part. Agricultural residues, very substantial. Forest residues, very substantial. Wood processing waste, this would be like sawmill residues, and municipal solid waste. We have huge quantities. In the other report, they said only about 50% of SAF can be produced from the bio-based feedstocks because they took in a more conservative approach. They took into account competing uses, and their estimate is more realistic. So the World Economic Forum report said, oh, this is how much they've got available, whereas most of the other reports only say this much. So this is in exajoules, but just ignore that. It's just really to illustrate in a picture form that we read these reports, but there are lots of different considerations, and sometimes these reports can be very misleading. We have to realize that you cannot just take a report as gospel. You have to understand what they were really doing and what they took into account in order to estimate real viability. Also, as I said, that if you work with the low energy density feedstocks, you have to really look at the local level, not the global level. So for every country, you need to do a feedstock estimate, and then even on a smaller scale, within like 100, 200 kilometer radius, you need to understand, and this kind of information can really help companies to decide where to locate their projects. Because you must know whether you are going to have enough feedstock within that limited radius. So a lot of these reports use GIS, Geographic Information Systems, to map this type of availability. So the 2023 billion-ton report is available online, and there's also a website with the database, and you can download all of this information and go and look at specific areas to see what is available within that county or another county. What this one report from ICF did show is that where are these feedstocks located? So for each region in the world, so APAC is Asia Pacific, Europe, Latin America, North America, Africa, and the Middle East, there are different feedstocks available to produce different types of SAF. So in Asia Pacific, there are a lot of waste gases available. So this is just because there's more industry and production facilities, so more waste gases, biomass from dedicated land, woody biomass, so agricultural waste and municipal waste. So there's just variables, but what is important to realize is that unlike crude oil, every country potentially has access to feedstocks to produce SAF, and these will vary. And currently, the International Civil Aviation Organization is doing these types of roadmaps for each country, and I'm going to be doing one for India, but even companies like Boeing and so on are doing this kind of assessment for individual countries, and you can access them online, such as there's Japan, there's the UAE, and all of these reports give you a feedstock assessment and potential SAF production for each country. Yeah, so as I said, for low energy density feedstocks, the SAF production will be located where the feedstocks are. But like lipids, oils and fats, we have a lot of crops being produced worldwide. As I said, about 220 million tons. Palm oil is the biggest one. Then we've got soybean oil, rapeseed oil, sunflower oil. And this is globally available and can essentially be transported everywhere. As I said, the World Economic Forum report actually gave a reasonably accurate assessment of 38 million tons. So the IEA basically said that demand is approaching the supply limits of most of these used waste. So I've been going to different conferences, and I gave a talk last week as well, which basically I'm trying to get people to see this. The HEFA process is the only fully commercial process. And while we are trying to commercialize these other ones, like gasification, this company just closed down, and this was the first commercial scale facility using municipal solid waste. So we have a problem that these other technologies are taking much longer than what we expect. What we've got is HEFA and alcohol to jet pretty soon. But what we've got is HEFA. We're going to run out of waste, fats and oils. So we will probably, a lot of companies are starting to access, some of these crops. So the EU has banned crops. But the reality is that there are companies in Asia Pacific and so on that they're going to be producing SAF from some of these crops. In soybean oil, maybe palm oil is a little bit tricky, but soybean oil, rapeseed oil, and so on. But I think a huge opportunity, from a SAF perspective, is that we need to try and solve the problem for getting more bigger volumes of these emerging crops. So trying to address the challenges for planting cover crops, which is a sort of what I would call a low-hanging fruit. Those are relatively simple crops where there's a lot of research, and we know that they have a very good carbon intensity. So that is really an opportunity. And if we look back at, say, this the World Economic Forum, even though these don't exist yet, but if you look at the potential for oil cover crops, 70 million tons. So we can, by addressing the challenges for getting farmers to actually plant these crops and helping to put supply chains into place for processing these, we can dramatically increase the volume of oils and fats that we have available, and even other types of oil crops. So although on what is achievable, and expanding these crops is achievable. And that's also something under the US SAF Grant Challenge. I don't know if you've heard of that, but basically they are targeting 3 billion gallons of SAF by 2030 and 35 billion gallons by 2050, which is about, times 4. So between 10 and 12 billion liters by 2030 in the US. And one of the approaches that they are taking to get there, they're looking at the technologies and all sorts of other aspects, but one of the aspects that they are really focusing on is how to actually get farmers to plant more of these crops, and putting in place policies and incentives and so on to make this happen, because this is really an achievable objective for the near term. Algal oils, a lot of people are interested in algal oils, but I still think that it's going to be challenging to produce large volumes and at a price that will be feasible for SAF production. And if we look at, oil crops, even though we can transport it everywhere, there's a big difference in terms of where these crops are grown. Palm oil, for example, soybean oil, and although we can transport it everywhere, bear in mind that the transport itself will make it cost more, and the transport itself will have some emissions associated with it. So we still want to try and produce it close to the feedstock. But where it is produced will also determine the supply chains. If we look at forest residues, so here in Canada, Russia, and some of these other countries, we have the boreal forest, which is more softwoods, pine, spruce, and so on. Whereas in some of these other countries, you will have hardwood trees. So I think the idea is never to use the lumber for SAF production, whole logs. It's not economical in the first place, but it's also not sustainable unless trees are damaged and create a fire hazard. So here in Canada, for example, in British Columbia, because of climate change, it wasn't getting cold enough in winter. So the mountain pine beetle started killing off millions and millions of acres of trees. And this is, of course, now a massive fire hazard, which is contributing to these huge fires that they even burn under the snow. They call them zombie fires. So they just start up again next year in summer. There's also a big difference between natural forest versus plantations. So here in Brazil, US Southeast, you will get a lot of plantations rather than natural forest. Agricultural residues will depend on where it's grown, and of course, corn, maize. The residues, you will probably get far more residues from corn plants than from wheat. Like wheat, you've got shorter growing seasons, you've got smaller plants and so on. And rice is mainly here in Southeast Asia. So that is where you will get the availability. Sugarcane bagasse, also warmer climates. And that is why in both in India, this area, and here, they are focusing a lot, not just on the bagasse, but on the sugarcane ethanol to jet. Municipal solid waste, it is estimated by 2040, and this is from the World Bank, that there would be about 3.4 billion tons of municipal solid waste available, which can be used to produce SAF. This depends on different countries, of course, with the US having very, very high waste generation, high income countries, and so on. The problem is we've got all this, but do we have the technology that can solve the challenges with this feedstock? In feedstock readiness level, so just because you can produce a feedstock doesn't mean that it's actually ready for SAF production. So the Commercial Aviation Alternative Fuels Initiative in the US, together with the Idaho National Laboratories and the US Department of Agriculture, so in a similar way that you have a technology readiness level, they developed this feedstock readiness level. And it's based on the complete supply chain, as well as the integration between the feedstock and the conversion technology. And there are 4 components. Production. Can you achieve potential scale? What are the yields? Harvesting. The market. Is there a market for the co-products? Policy, regulatory compliance. For example, are the co-products approved for selling as an animal feed, and the linkage to the conversion process. You have to actually demonstrate SAF production at a smaller scale with that specific feedstock, because what we've seen is all of these feedstocks differ quite substantially in terms of the chemistry, the ash content, all of these different things. So it's important to realize that just because you can grow a feedstock, you need to assess whether this is actually a feedstock that is at a readiness level to be used for conversion. So stages of feedstock readiness, of course, preliminary feedstock evaluation, screening varieties and selection of suitable varieties. And a lot of companies have been developing these seeds over the last decade or even longer, trying to improve yields, etc., and that type of thing. And then experimental testing, feedstock trials. What are the yields? What is dependability of the supply, the harvest and logistic options? And, this is important if you look at feedstock trials, because let's say you want to now build a SAF refinery and you want to use this feedstock. The company might show you, oh, this is the yields we've got with our feedstock trials. But it's important to know whether they had realistic trials, how much fertilizer they planted. If it was just small little areas, you're not going to get the same yield with very large areas, because a small planting area will get more access to sunlight, so your plants will be bigger and you might get higher yields. a pre-commercial feedstock assessment, production cost of the feedstock, market competitiveness, and commercial scale deployment. What is, harvesting process? What is the sustainability? What is the integration? So you have to realize the feedstock must be ready for growing, because like a lot of companies contact me and say, we've got this feedstock and we want to promote it, but they need to establish all of these in order to show that it's ready for commercial production. And then, of course, get the farmers to plant it. And I think this is what, like in the US SAF Grant Challenge, one of the challenges that they recognize is that we need to develop new feedstocks and expand their commercial scale production to meet 2050 targets. Because many of the feedstock availability estimates rely on new and emerging feedstocks, not just the oilseed crops, but if you think of the miscanthus and the switchgrass and so on, they can be used, but we just don't have the scale of plantations. So targeting challenges and actually looking at how can policy and incentives be used to get greater production of these feedstocks, because policies are definitely needed. And examples would be funding and grants for, say, new crops and genetic improvement of yields and properties of feedstocks, subsidies to farmers to plant emerging crops, and then other feedstock development, how to increase the yield, continuing research and development, how to reduce the cost, and how to improve the sustainability. One of the things that I came across in terms of these new feedstocks, and it was kind of a surprise. It was, I think, a master's research thesis that was done at MIT in Boston. And so they looked at these cover crops and realized that one of the biggest challenges is that farmers couldn't actually get crop insurance. So it's critical for a farmer to have crop insurance, because if there's like a hurricane or hail or a tornado that destroys the crop, they want insurance to pay out, because otherwise they will go bankrupt. But to get crop insurance for a brand new crop is very difficult, because the US Department of Agriculture approves the crops based on data. So unless a company developing a new crop can provide enough data, they will not approve crop insurance for that crop. And at the same time, the farmer is, if he's worried about this new crop, maybe he has to now pay more crop insurance, and he doesn't even know whether he's going to make his money on the other crop. And so recently, I think earlier this year, the US Department of Agriculture, for example, approved certain states for crop insurance for camelina, I think, and pennycress or something like that. But unless that process is in place, then it will be impossible for farmers to get that crop insurance, and they're not going to plant it. So what we are realizing is that feedstocks can present quite a lot of challenges that don't seem to be so huge. It almost seems more administrative. But unless we understand this, and unless we put in place things to tackle these challenges, identify and then overcome these challenges, we're not going to get these feedstocks. So there's a lot of focus just on the technologies and how we can make the technologies work. But we also need to focus on some of these, I think, less sexy, less scientific challenges that will really impact the availability of feedstocks for SAF production. So I think those things are quite important. I'm just wondering, Harry, whether we should stop there.
We still have 25 minutes left, unless you have
I
finished.
know. I'm just thinking of, spacing it out between today and tomorrow.
Yeah, it's completely up to you. Obviously, we've got modules 3 and 4 to go tomorrow as well. But yeah, I know what you're more aware of what you've got content-wise. So if you think it would work better that way, we can do that.
Yeah, I think let's just continue tomorrow. 3 hours is quite long for everybody to concentrate.
Yeah, no problem at all. In which case, I'll just check no one's got any more questions for Susan before we finish up for the day. If you have, do so, put them in the chat or come off mute for a second. Completely up to you. But I think that's probably everyone sorted. In which case, yeah, thank you very much. We'll join you all again tomorrow using the same link at the same time. So thank you. Have a nice rest of the day wherever you are. Thanks, Susan.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.